All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this pre-recorded episode of the Gin and Tonic Show. Again, we are pre-recording because Moose is having fun, and for him to continue enjoying his fun, we don't want to cause issues. So we're going to be pre-recording a few episodes. Today we have our friend Culture Jenny on.
Hello, folks. I will be here adding my knowledge about culture and history.
Yeah, it's today we got some fun topics. So let's get started with the first one. If I can share screen. Uh, okay, so the first one is basically a short where someone explains the Ark of the Covenant. Before we actually go to that video, Culture Jenny, you want to explain what the Ark of the Covenant is?
The Ark of the Covenant, it was, uh, a container containing containing a tribute was it from Solomon to the Queen of Sheba, or was it from Sheba to Solomon and then carried back to the land of Sheba?
I think it was given from Solomon directly because he
Yeah,
was the one that was prophesying, or he's considered prophet, right? So
yeah.
he was probably from that.
The Ark of the Covenant is a container, and what is contained within was either was given by Solomon, but the container itself was either taken from the land of Sheba up to Solomon and then brought back, or it was made also up there, then brought down as a gift. But anyway, the Ark of the Covenant is also said to be existing in Ethiopia according to Ethiopic biblical Christian tradition. So there it does exist some interesting myths and cultural mythologies surrounding this object.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so important that even Harrison.
Also, if you have any of you people have seen one of the Indiana Jones movies, then opening the Ark of the Covenant was not that great of an idea by the Nazis in that movie.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say before as well that it's so important even Harrison Jones went up for it. But yeah, in that case, let's see what this person, Billy Carson, has to say about it.
You go back to the story of Moses, it really was Pharaoh Akhenaten. Moses is not the real name. That's the made-up name. Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was ushering in monotheism in Egypt while he was a pharaoh, worshiping Amen-Ra, the great Amen. Amen-Ra was one of these Anunnaki people, said, look, from now on, there'll be no other God but me. That made it into the Bible. When you say thanks, you say thanks to me, you say amen. That made it into the Bible. Teach the people only to worship me, not any of my other relatives. I'm the only one and true God.
Yeah.
Amen has nothing to do with Akhenaton. It has to do with a Semitic old root that means more or less believe or be in safety.
Yeah, no, I caught that, but then I was like, I wasn't too versed in the history of that particular.
So the Amen has nothing, It's the same root as Iman in Arabic, as belief.
Yeah.
Or Tamin, which is insurance.
Yeah, no, I was thinking what the difference would be between the Iman and Amin, but then I also was thinking there's a lot of Coptic influence as well. So because I didn't know the history,
it's Hebrew. You remember Hebrew is Arabic and Hebrew are related languages. They are kind of as similar as Swedish and German.
Yeah.
So there will be a lot of similar words.
All right. Yeah.
But
that makes
but
a lot of
Emin
sense.
doesn't have anything to do with Akhenaten or Akhenaten.
All right. Yeah. So that's a falsity on this part. So let's
Yeah.
continue and see what else he has to say.
And he began to do that. Then he made an order to go start defacing all the hieroglyphs and all of these statues around Egypt. That's why the noses and the ears are chipped off. That's why the faces are chipped off everywhere you go. Bodies are chipped away. It wasn't done. The hypothesis on the streets is that it was done because white people back then didn't want black people to know that there were black people in Egypt. That's actually false. The true reality is this was done in ancient times, and it was carried on by Coptic Christians long before Jesus was even born. If you go back to
No, that's what put me. That's what got me
Christians
because
before Jesus was born.
there's no
Coptic Christians. The anachronism here, and also the Sphinx. It's doubtful that the nose lacking from the Sphinx is probably a later destruction of the Sphinx. It is
Yeah.
pre-Islamic, but it's probably sometime around the time of the Roman invasion.
Yeah, I was
Because
actually watching Graham Hancock. Now I know some people think that he's a pseudoscientist, but he was mentioning that there's evidence for water erosion and such from 11,600 years ago, and then what the the dynastic Egyptians did to the Sphinx was basically take the lion's head and carve it down to a head of a human, to remove all the erosion due to water and weather that happened in the 6,000 years between the original creation of the Sphinx and dynastic Egypt.
I
So I
didn't
don't
know
know how
that.
much. Yeah, I don't know how much that's true or not, but this is something that Graham Hancock mentions on his research in some of his podcasts.
I'm not an Egyptologist or well versed in Egyptian history. If you don't mean by Egyptian history after Allah's invasion of Egypt, then I can speak about Egyptian history. But still, I mean, this was obviously a short that tried to argue that Christianity and religion generally probably isn't true by using these arguments. But this is also an example that if you can argue for something that is right, but use wrong arguments and wrongful argumentation.
Yeah,
And
you're not.
the anachronistic mistakes and the issues of arguments when it comes to semantics and linguistical origins of words are still not good, even if it was for a good aim in quotation marks.
Yeah, this guy. One thing that I also remember is that a lot of these harmful. So the actual pharaoh he was mentioning did actually try to preach his own version of monotheistic cultures.
I know that Akhenaten did try to do that, but there is also I also think that he would try to argue against this sort of view that Egypt was entirely black, because he did mention it in the video as well. So it was kind of like this Afrocentrist view of everything of the Egyptian history has been whitewashed. It was in truth black. But the truth of the matter is, if we are going to speak about ethnicity in Egypt, is that sure, the Egyptians spoke a Hamitic language, a language that was more related to languages in the sub-Saharan regions of Africa, further down south. But that does not mean that the Egyptians themselves, with the exceptions of certain Nubians and Nubian dynasties, were black. They conflate culture and race a lot, these Afrocentrist historians. And they don't see that, you can share a culture, but not necessarily share the same skin color.
And considering the areas that Egypt actually conquered or had, I
They were
consider
very
that Egypt was very mixed. They probably had some
Yeah,
Arab,
yes, I was about to say that. If you went down into, the upper Nile regions, I mean, the upper Nile, which is down south, then you will get, extremely dark-skinned Nubian Persians during this area, and still to this very day. And these people were just as Egyptian culturally as those up in the upper parts of the Nile. Or in the lower parts of the Nile,
yeah.
in the north. Oh
So yeah,
God!
just as a thing for the audience to mention is that the Egypt was split into two parts: Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt being of the north, closer to Nile Delta into the Mediterranean, because that's the end of the Nile River. That's the lower end of it. Whereas the upper end of the Nile River comes from, I believe, modern day Ethiopia. That's where
Yes,
the lake is being currently dammed, and the Egypt's having an issue. So that's
yeah,
the
and
upper region.
that is why there might be a war on the horizon. And considering that Ethiopia is currently in a civil war, uh,
Yeah, so that's just like a clearing up of the confusion. But in another point as well is that there were multiple dynasties. I believe it's like close to like 30 dynasties in Egypt, meaning there's a lot of influences from multiple cultures within Egypt. Egypt
yeah,
lasted like close to 4,000, 3,000 years, right? In
yeah,
multiple
it's a
dynamics.
long civilizational history that needs to be considered. It wasn't a monolith by any stretch of the definition.
Yeah, and one thing that that got me with the Netflix series of Cleopatra is because they think that Egyptians, because they're in North Africa, they have to look a certain way, but they tend to forget that the dynasty that Cleopatra was in was Macedonian. Let
Yeah,
alone
it
let's
was
like
Greek.
yeah, let's not even worry
The
about like breeding.
Ptolemies.
Yeah, the Ptolemies and like not even like breeding with other Greeks. They were breeding within their own family. So
Yes,
like there's
because
gonna be no change in skull color.
they took the ancestral bit about Egyptian pharaonic marriages within the family and took it to an extreme.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where they're not very, as you would say,
Rep-
African.
representative.
Yeah. Small fact: Cleopatra, Proctor the Seventh, I believe, the one that married Mark Antony and Caesar. She was the only one that actually spoke Egyptian. The rest of the Ptolemies were speaking Greek with each other, and that
Yes.
too, it wasn't even proper Greek. It was all Macedonia was the hillbilly hicks, the rednecks of Greece. So they weren't even speaking proper Greek.
I mean, I mean, I am not an expert on Greek. I can't even speak Greek. Though I had been in seminars about Greek history where they speak about these various dialects of Attic and Dorian Greek, I think it is. And so, I mean, Greek already always had very diverse versions of it.
Yeah,
And what we call ancient classical Greek is more or less a mix. It was kind of like a trade language or something. Kind of like how the Arabs developed their version of classical Arabic Fusha from first, I would say poetry, but even the poetical language was developed in part by the Kinda Confederation as kind of like a trade language. This is also the language used in the Quran.
yeah, for sure. So let's go to the next short as well, so then we can get into the main topic after this one.
Yes.
This one is our special friend, Sajid Lipum. Now,
Oh
whatever you
yeah.
might say about his views, I actually find him a lot more honest than someone like Daniel Hakikachu. So I'll respect Sajid for that, for being at least honest and wanting to study and calling people out when they have bullshit. Because like if he's in America, he's right to have his own views and opinions. That's what America's foundations are built on. But at least he's being honest about what he views rather than just saying some outrageous things for the sake of publicity. So on that note, let's see what he has to say about ex-Muslims.
People who are living Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is replacing them with better people, more qualified and quality set of people are coming into Islam. Because when you look at the list of people coming into Islam, you will see that there are people that even when they become Muslims, they are making better contributions than most of the born Muslims. So when people are living Islam, you will see that most of the people that are living Islam, there are people of ignorance, people who have very little knowledge about Islam. That is why when you ask many of them few questions about Islam that a Muslim is supposed to know, you will see that they don't know it. They are people of Hawa, people who are seeking the dunya. They leave Islam because they want to get some benefit from the other side of the coin. People who are living Islam.
All right. So what do you have to say to that culture, Ginny?
I mean, it is kind of poisoning the well, and being strawmanning everyone that is leaving Islam, because, of course, in his view, it cannot be for any reason except that they can't, stomach the requirements of the religion, or that they are driven by their basal desires to leave the religion. But the fact of the matter is that you can have a slew of reasons as to why you leave a religion, or why do you decide to, to abandon Islam specifically. It can be because you have found another religion that you think is more closer to the truth. It can be that you are no longer convinced of the ideas behind Islam and you become an atheist. It can be because you have discovered something else that takes your interest away from Islam. Sure, this can also be based on desires and you not being able to endure the rules of Islam, but it can be a myriad of reasons as to why you think that Islam is no longer the religion for you. And just setting it to two alternatives: either you're driven by your basal desires or you accept Islam as the truth. It's actually a false dichotomous argument.
So I would point out as well is that he seems to have some sort of malice towards people who leave it, but a benefit for people who accept it. Now, I would only say that if someone has the right to accept a religion, they also have the right to leave the religion. And you should give them the same respect that you would give them if they join the religion, if they leave it, because they're exercising the same right. It's the it's the same right as voting, right? You should respect someone for voting, and then you should also respect someone who doesn't want to vote.
I accept that as my principle, but the problem is that Islam has a lot of rules regarding ridda, or apostasy, or irtidad, and that means that leaving the religion isn't just leaving the religion for the third party believing Muslim. It is also this also connects to because a person leaving the religion isn't just an issue for the one leaving the religion. It is also an issue for the Muslims around him, because they need to hold each other accountable. It's called hisba, and if they aren't holding these apostates accountable for having left the religion, then they are considered bad Muslims, for those that believe in this sort of view that you are accountable for the actions of others in the community. Not every Muslim is like this, but there does exist a belief among several groups within Islam and among a large group of believers within Islam that this is the case.
But if you're living in a country that enforces the Sharia law itself, I would understand having that mentality. But Sajid here, who's agreeing with what the gentleman said, offering no rebuttal, he's enjoying the freedoms of secular values, of being able to follow his own religion and convert to it from Christianity. How would he feel if Christians had the same mindset that Muslims have against people leaving Christianity? Right? Why is
I don't want to presume, but I do think he would find it extremely oppressive and tyrannical. But the issue here is that but he could also have the view, which is a very consistent view with his beliefs, that since his religion is, in his view, correct, then it's not equal to other incorrect religions and believers that believe in incorrect religions to act the same way, as they are not equal.
Yeah, and that I think would be the definition of hypocrisy, because rights for me but not rights for D, right?
Oh, it's not hypocrisy. It is actually not hypocritical. But it's very intolerant, I give you that, and it's not good in our subjective view of it. But it's not hypocritical, because if you have this statement that you believe that you are correct and others are wrong in their beliefs, then your view of which religion should dominate is different from those others. Because you are correct, they are not.
Yeah.
I mean, they have done bad things by not being believers, by not or acting in a certain way when not being believers. It's kind of like this. I mean, we say that, for example, murder is bad, killing is bad, and thus murder, if it is done without justification. But
we'd like to remind our customers, masks are optional.
But if I got thrown off my red line here, kind of in my thoughts by. Anyway, if an action is unjust, it could normally it could be argued to be just if the context or reasons behind the actions are considered. For example, killing can in certain contexts be good, and in certain contexts be considered bad. And thus, oppression and, punishing those that leave a religion can in certain cases be considered good and in certain cases bad, according to the believer. As long as it's, if you're a believer in Islam, you can think that, it's okay to punish people that leave Islam because Islam, unlike the other religions, is true. Do you understand?
Yeah, I understand that. It's that kind of intolerance just doesn't sit with me. Where he had, because I've stated the position multiple times as well, where hating him for, like, even before we saw the short, we mentioned that he's honest about having his own views. We accept him having his views, and it's his right to have his views, right? In him not seeing that or giving the respect back, but still having this benefit I think it kind of hurts. But yeah.
I mean, I don't know his views, and I can't make a statement yet because I haven't looked into depth into his views. But if he, for example, is not a liberal or doesn't believe in any liberal ideas, then he not having these liberal ideals about tolerance or reciprocity with other tolerant persons is not, hypocrisy. It is just intolerance.
Yeah. All right, so let's move to the document here. This document, Racism, Slavery, History, in Islam. Now, you had some. I sent this to you thinking that this is some BS, and you also had some views as well. And to the
Oh, yeah.
offer, I tried reaching out to this T.O. Shanavas
Shanavas.
as well. I didn't get any response, so I'll try again. But if at any point they see this and they want to come on, I'm more than happy to host a discussion. But yeah, so on that note, what in an overarching sense, what was your objections with this? And then we'll also go in detail one by one as much as we can.
My objections are many. Let's just leave it at that and then go into the details.
All right, so let's start with some specific ones.
Should we just read it and then?
Yeah, I'll start
Okay.
reading it. So
Yes.
basically, this talks about the other books they discussed or wrote. So the Islamic theory of evolution and evolutionism. We'll put this in the description. So in our current Trump world of alternative right and other white supremacists with their anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist creed, it is deemed necessary to search for guidance for the Muslim interaction etiquette with the people of different races. Moreover, these Islamophobes and their media outlets spread the canard that the slavery of ISIS is guided by Muslim religious texts. So any issue with that?
Continue on,
All right.
because it will be made more clear later.
So we will review the slavery at the time of the origin of Islam. Furthermore, Islamophobia of many Republican politicians and white supremacists has the underpinning in their white racism. Also, racism and slavery are interconnected. We will review race relations within an Islamic context. Now, I love how they pin Republican politicians with white supremacy. If you're a Republican, you're inherently white supremacist, is what they're trying to convey here, I believe.
Yeah. I also had an issue because, sure, there does exist Republicans that are clearly racist in the United States, but not every Republican is racist. And there are actually a lot that aren't at all. So this is just poisoning the well and attacking the people rather than actually going into the arguments, but saying that you all have these ideas because you are X or something, rather than going at why these ideas are bad in themselves. But let's continue.
All right. So it is true that Prophet tolerated slavery initially. Prophet Muhammad came at a time when slavery was sanctioned by the Holy Scriptures of Jews and Christians and practiced it all over the world. Sadly, slaves were a normal commodity in the marketplaces. For example, ye shall take them, the slaves, as an inheritance for your children after you. To inherit them, the slaves, for a possession, they shall be your bondmen, slaves forever. Leviticus 25:46. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if its answer to you is peace and it opens to you, then all people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, then you shall besiege it. You shall put all its males to the sword, but the woman and the little ones, the cattle, and everything else in the city, all its spoils, you shall take as booty for yourselves, and you shall enjoy the spoils of the enemies. Deuteronomy 20:10-17. Moreover, the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and other families that are with you, which they beget in your land, they shall be your possessions. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them or possessions. They shall be your bondmen forever. Leviticus 25:44-46. Servants be subject to your masters, of all fear not only to the good in general, but also to the forward. 1 Peter 2:18. Servants, be obedient to them, that your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Ephesians 6:5. So all these I think are true statements. But one thing is, this is
It's
what
kind.
about it?
Yes, it's what of baptism. I mean, it also states just that the prophet tolerated slavery initially, implying that he stopped or made a statement against it in the later parts, but he didn't. Slavery was always allowed in Islamic traditions, and it's clear when you read all of the classical works of fiqh that slavery is a integral part of the Sharia that deals with commodities.
Yeah, and that doesn't excuse Quran verse 424, which allows for it, right? So it's
Yes.
all right. So let's continue to the paragraph here. The Western Christians abused Bible verses of the curse of Ham by Noah, Genesis 9:25, 20. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, territory may Japheth live, tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. To justify racism and enslavement of black Africans, they claim that Africans are the children of Canaan, and the black color of Africans is due to Noah's curse. Thereby, Christians Asilatized authorities in Europe, ruled by Ham's children, black Africans, were destined to be slaves to his brother's white descendants. Noah's curse was drafted to the service against American abolitionists in the Civil War.
I mean,
Now,
your voice was cutting out a bit when you read it, but let's just probably go forward with that. Our viewers heard it, but in any case, they can look at it in high definition on the YouTube screen. But anyway, when it comes to the abolitionists and to those that were against the abolitionists, I mean, the fact is that the Bible was used on both sides by abolitionists arguing against slavery and by those that wanted to preserve slavery. And it's true that the curse of Ham was used as an argument there. But you also have similar traditions about the curse of Ham in certain Islamic traditions as well. So it isn't exclusive to Christianity. And also regarding the curse of Ham, it very much developed mostly in Protestant traditions, as the Catholic Church actually did try to despite slavery being more prevalent in Southern America, in the Catholic parts of the New World, it was still the case that the Catholic Church actually tried to argue against slavery, because in the Catholic Church you can't enslave a Christian because that is against Catholic theology, and you can't have unbelieving slaves because if they are unbelievers, you should either kill them or convert them.
yeah, and
So that
I
was
know
the view
these
of
two, yeah,
that was the view of the Catholic Church back in the early modern period and Renaissance.
yeah. So let's see the next paragraph as well. So, widely celebrated Muslim scholar of the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun, rejected the Western explanation for the black color of Africans and proposed a truly scientific explanation. Genealogists who had no knowledge of the true nature of things imagined Negroes were the children of Ham, the son of Noah, and they were singled out for being black as a result of Noah's curse, which produces Ham's color and slavery of God inflicted upon his descendants. Black skin, common to the inhabitants of the first and second zones. Ibn Khaldun divided northern hemisphere of the Earth into 7 north zones, and the first zone runs along the equator, and it follows the north successively by the second set through 7 zones. It is the result of the composition of air in which they live, and which comes out under the influence of the greatly increased heat in the south. The sun is at the zenith there twice a year at short intervals. In all seasons, the sun is in accumulation for a long time. The light of the sun, therefore, is plentiful. People there go through very severe summer. Their skin turns black because of excessive heat, which I'll give him credit for saying that.
Ibn
Especially knowing
Khaldun,
it.
I know that Ibn Khaldun said this in the Al-Muqaddimah, because I have read this and I actually found it very interesting that he actually did point towards environmental factors as being the cause of skin color. And then he thinks it's inherited down because you got, as one of your ancestors got sunburned. I mean, it doesn't work exactly like that, but it's at least a lot closer than believing it was a sort of curse.
Yeah. It's a pretty scientific explanation that he gave, and I'll give him credit for that. So the evil race of Muslims until the affluence from the oil economy corrupted rich Arab nations, even though the Quran cautions Muslims against racism and description. It states mankind was one nation, Quran 10:19. O mankind, we created you male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. Quran 49:13. Surely the believers are brethren, so reconcile within your own brethren and venerate God, that perhaps you may have mercy. Quran 49:10. Within this maximum racial divisive frame of mind, vanished from converts to Islam. Umar ibn Khattab, the son of an African mother, became the second head of state after Prophet. Bilal, an African slave, became a revered companion of the Prophet. The extension of racial prejudices within the Muslim community is well documented by Western historians.
Might I
But
add
why-
some things here?
Yes. Go ahead.
I mean, if we are going to disregard the fact that some of these sentences aren't grammatically structured correctly, but anyway, then we can at least say that some of these arguments are kind of like, he says the Quran states that you should be united, and it does have similar views, and it does state similar things in the Arabic Quran as what is said here. Be united, do not divide each other, do not hate each other. So the Quran does have this message, but there is also the things in the Sunnah, for example, where it describes, for example, the Turks as being the eternal enemies of the Muslims. Yes, the Turks, back before, when they were Asiatic steppe nomads. There are hadiths about the Turks that are very anti-Turkish in certain regards. And then there are also hadiths about Ethiopians and hadiths about certain other groups around the world that aren't that, non-racist, you could say. But it should also be remembered that these hadiths and much of Islam, when Islam was came to be as a cultural phenomenon, Islam was a result in many regards of its time. If we are talking about early medieval, late antiquity, then we aren't talking about an age where tolerance and acceptance was, the norm. And the Quran and Islam generally wasn't much more intolerant than the rest of the world. And I do mention, for example, here that Omar ibn Khattab did have the son of an African mother. This is a little bit of a misgiving. His mother, if I'm not entirely mistaken, was an Ethiopian. And sure, they were darker skinned, but they were also considered the Habashi, or the Ethiopians, in this case the Axumites, were considered different from other Africans, as they were considered kind of civilized. They were, in fact, they were arguably a lot even more civilized than the Arabs of this time in certain regards, before they managed to conquer their big empire. So it wasn't considered bad to have to be the result of relationships with Ethiopians, as they were considered their own category. There's also the fact that Omar was also of the Quraysh. And when you speak about racism here, you should also remember that in order to become the leader, the head of the state of a caliphate, you have to be from the Quraysh. You have to be of a Qurayshi bloodline. And if that is not a idea about group privilege based upon ethnicity, I don't know what is. So
Yeah.
you do have that matter also. You also have the matter of, for example, Bilal, an African slave. Sure, he was African, and he was entrusted with a lot of, duties. So, well, it's true that there are also these tolerant or even progressive elements of Islam. There are also things that point in the other direction.
Yeah, for sure. I was also going to put it in a sense where they also have the information of the conflicts with the Christians and Jews at the time.
Yeah, but
Because
those are religious conflicts, not ethnic conflicts in the same way.
Now, I know this might be considered a dog shit take, as the kids say, but wouldn't Judaism be considered both an ethnicity and a religion at the same time?
Yes, but it depends upon which aspect you're attacking. And it was mostly the religious aspect. So, I mean, many of the Jewish the Jews on the Arabian Peninsula were also Arabs that had converted to Judaism. For example, the Himyarites converted to Judaism, but they were Qahtani Arabs.
Yeah.
Qahtan is one of these, lines of forefathers of the Arabs. So, but so the conflict between the Jews and the, Arabic Muslims wasn't really an ethnic conflict as much as it was a religious conflict. But should we continue?
Yeah, let's continue to the next three quotes here from various historical references. So, famous British historian Arnold J. Toynbee states, "What value are we going to place on Islam? Islam's greatest gift to mankind is monotheism, and we surely dare not throw this gift away. two conspicuous sources of danger, one psychological and the other material. In the present relations of this cosmopolitan proletarian, or i.e. westernized humanity, if dominant element in our modern Western society are rare consciousness and alcohol.
Race
And in the
consciousness
struggle-
and alcohol.
Raise consciousness and alcohol. And in the struggle with each of these evils, the Islamic spirit has a service to render which might prove, if it were accepted, be of higher moral and social value. The extension of race consciousness as between Muslims is one of the outstanding moral achievements of Islam. And in the contemporary world, there is, as it happens, a crying need for propagation of Islamic virtue.
Propagation of this Islamic virtue. But, I would actually argue against this. Sure, Islam never developed for most of its time, this sort of racial ideas that came, especially in the 19th century with Darwinism and the like, and the eugenics movement and everything connected to that. But there did exist racial hierarchies from the beginning when it came to certain groups within society. For example, blacks were usually seen as lower standing and as slaves in most of the early Arabic history, and this still continued also to Ottoman times. So you had segregated parts of, for example, Baghdad or Basra in Iraq for black people. But also in conjunction to this, you also had a higher degree of flexibility. So it wasn't fixed categories. You could still, as a black person, actually come pretty far in most of these Islamic societies as well. So, and you also had very weird other social categories. For example, I mentioned the Turks before, where certain Turks were, considered bad, but if you showed your front feet, so to say, you could be considered as, kind of assimilated or as not being like the rest and thus actually be promoted. And you also, and it should also be mentioned that even in early history, times and racial views were very changing. For example, during the early Umayyad Caliphate, if you weren't a pure-blooded Arab, and I mean you could trace your lineage back at least 5 generations of being a pure-blooded Arab, then you weren't considered for any work or assignment within the government of the Umayyad Caliphate, in most cases. So, but that was lessened when the Abbasids took control. But you also had, even during the Umayyad time, you often had a lot of local rulership and local rule where you actually could succeed as an individual that was a non-Arab. And you had these almost semi-autonomous groups that had their own rulership, their own customs, and their own laws within the Umayyad Caliphate that, had other rules than those that were mostly the standards for the greater realm. So racial relations and racial hierarchies were very movable and flexible things throughout much of early Islamic history, and also in later Islamic history.
Yeah.
But I can still kind of grant that it might have been, in certain regards, better than the West, but it certainly wasn't tolerant by modern Western standards, and I mean modern as in post-70s standards of Western thought on racial relationships.
And this kind of equity also existed previously before the Islam as well with the Romans, right?
Yes, but the Romans actually, they weren't so much racists as they were giant, cultural xenophobes. They had larger issues with, white Germanic and Gallic peoples than they had with black Africans that were, quote unquote, civilized in some manner.
Yeah, because the Black Egyptians were all, or like the Africans had a lot of them had a lot less. There were still tribes there, but a lot less tribalistic than the nomadic tribes or the Germanic tribes and such, right?
Yes.
So they kind of saw tribalism as more of a barbaric kind of thing. So
Yes.
so they were culturally xenophobes, but it's kind of hilarious to see that they didn't have any racism about who they'll take as a slave. They'll just take anyone that they conquer.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but you also have to consider that, for example, for the Romans, a Nubian living in a Nubian city in southern Egypt was more like the Romans themselves than a Germanic barbarian that lived in the forest up in northern Europe.
Oh,
So,
God.
yeah, I mean, the ancient world was very different from our modern world.
I kind of
And
want to get a time
improve-
machine and go back to kind of see the logic behind this stuff.
Yes, but it's very important that we don't impose our values or our ideas about the world onto the ancient world when we discuss
Yeah, no, it's
these
more
things.
so about the curiosity of that kind of logic, right? So I kind of want to like go back and see because like
I mean, it's not that unlogical if you think that. I mean, most people today that are bordering Russia have a very negative view of Russia due to, the recent war in Ukraine. But they don't have the same view of other peoples that are maybe even further away and that are even more different in other regards. So, I mean, you do develop also a kind of antagonistic relationship to those that are, much more prone to be in conflict with you. And the Romans were battling the Gauls and the Germans constantly.
yeah. So let's continue to this next point here.
Yes.
So similarly, American historian and philosopher William Durant, Muhammad's ethics transcended the limit of tribes. The believers are not else than brothers. Distinction of rank or race so strong amongst the tribes was diminished by the similarity of belief. If Negro slave is appointed to rule you, hear and obey him. It was a noble conception that made one people of diverse nations scattered over continents.
I mean, Will Durant, I actually liked a lot of his history, but he was rather, bad when it came to. The Durant pair was rather bad when it came to Middle Eastern history, but still, I can accept the fact that Islam actually did unite a lot of tribal groups under one banner. But to say that it transcended the limits of tribe, I mean, you still had, ideas within Islam, and especially within Shia Islam, of, certain bloodlines being more, better than others, with Ahlul Bayt and everything as associated with the house of Muhammad and, the later line of Ali and, everything that is connected to that. And those things do not transcend tribe. They just established tribe instead as being, this tribe is better than the other tribes. Do you agree,
and
Nikhil?
I also get the sense that they don't have like tribes, but they'll also like the schools of thought division is very tribalistic.
Yeah, but that is more about ideology. That is something that you can change in a way that you can't really do with bloodlines.
Yeah, but it has a lot of the way they fight is very tribalistic. It might not.
I mean, it is tribal in a way, in a one certain definition of tribal, but in others not. Sure, I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate here. I mean,
Because
this entire text is so bad that I am actually harsher on it than I usually am. But I will give, at least this benefit of doubt when it comes to tribalism, when it comes to religious conflicts, when it's pure religion. When it is about belief, it is something that you can still, in a certain way, change. Sure, you can change your belief in that way, but you can change your proclamation of belief, your piety in regards to that belief.
yeah, so for me, I would say like Islam or very strict Sharia law. The only difference that it would have from the definition of an apartheid that we had in South America or South Africa, I mean, is the fact that it's not based off of race but religion. So it's only a one-word loophole that differentiates Sharia from an apartheid and a tribalistic kind of thing. And I think
But,
saying that it's not a tribalistic or a kind of thing is basically like a tax loophole or some kind of legal definitional loophole that you can find. But in all other aspects,
I still think that that belief shouldn't really be conflated with race, though. Or bloodlines. Those things are quite different. I would still argue that in, you know, the favor of Islam actually being a kind of bridging element in this regard, or rather that, or rather the opposite, in that these conflicts regarding ideology within Islam are not tribalistic; they are sectarian.
yeah. So let's cover the next point as well here. Um, Edward W. Blyden, the father of Pan-Africanism, states, Mohammedan religion, on the other hand, disregarding all advantageous circumstances, seeks for the real man, neglect accidental for essential, the advantageous for the integral. Hence, it distinguished all distinctions found upon race, color, and nationality. I admonish you to fear God, said Muhammad to his followers, and yield obedience to his successor, although he may be black slave. And therefore, throughout the history of Islam, in all countries, race, or previous conditions, has been no barrier to elevation. Frequent are the instances in which proud Arabs have submitted to the rule of aliens, even if the aliens are Negro slaves. An American missionary resident in Egypt calls attention to the entire absence of race prejudices in that country. This liberty, so far the Negro is concerned, may be chiefly the result of the role the religion of Jesus after 1800 years. Nowhere furnishes such practical evidence of cosmopolitan adaptation and power. Now, the thing he says about Egypt, they have an extreme xenophobia. It's very hard to do anything there.
This is the 19th century. I mean, it could have become worse. And I also think that this is from the 19th century, so he speaks about his experience there. And I do not doubt, considering how I knew about the racism in the 19th century, that this might have actually been true. That, Egypt was more racially progressive than Europe or, the United States during this time.
Yeah, it's Now it's not very good. That's all I gotta say. I don't want to get whacked by the Egyptians, but
No, I agree that there are a lot of tensions and issues, especially now in recent years with all the immigration coming from down south up into Egypt. There's been a lot of tensions due to that as well. But it's important to realize that the 19th century was different from modern day, and he's presenting this fact or this evidence to this fact here, and almost presenting in such a way as to imply that, oh, this applies now. But I mean, this was the 19th century. This was a different time. We live in the 21st century.
yeah, for sure. Now this is a big point that on the next page. So let's go through the next
Do
point
we
here.
skip essay leader, or should we read him as well?
Your wish. Is there anything noteworthy in here from it?
I mean, it's noteworthy to describe the fact that this also shows. It's actually quite interesting. I haven't actually read this part. I mean, this is an old historian as well, and he could reference some sort of manuscript that shows this. So maybe read it, because I think it's interesting to discuss.
For sure. So S.H. Leader, a British historian, described a meeting between Archbishop Cyprus and the head of deputation from Egypt. "Take away that black man," exclaimed the Christian Archbishop Cyrus. I can have no discussion with him. When the Arab conquerors had sent a deputation of their ablest men to discuss terms of surrender of the capital of Egypt, headed by the Negro Ubedad as the ablest of them. To the sacred archbishop's astonishment, he was told that this man was commissioned by the General Amr. But the Muslims held Negroes and white men's equal respect, judging a man by his character, not by his color. Well, if the Negro must lead, he must speak gently, ordered the prelate, so as not to frighten his white auditors. The reply of the Negro shows the spirit of those early conquerors. "There are 1,000 blacks as myself among your companions." Do you know about this encounter?
I have not known about this encounter, but it's an interesting example because, it shows that there did exist at least some sort of racial views back in that day among the Christians of Egypt. And it also shows that a lot of the early Muslims were pretty flexible, because later, about 100 years later, during the Umayyad rule, you do not see this sort of flexibility, or you do still see it in certain cases, but you have an implemented racial hierarchy by law by the Umayyads. So you can actually see that there is a lot of shifting, a very shifting nature. If this is because things changed over 100 years later, and the Umayyads adopted various practices or developed various racist practices later, or if this is just because you could actually, as an individual, transcend your racial hierarchy if you showed enough promise and ability. So you were discriminated against generally, but if you were an extraordinary individual, they could let it slide, or if you had correct contacts with certain people, they could overlook your race or your ethnicity. So this is actually a very interesting example of the complexities of race relations in late antiquity and in the late medieval period, or early medieval period. Oh God.
Yeah, and also forgot to mention, when we're filming this officially, it's going to be Eid, so Eid Mubarak to anyone watching. Yeah, but let's
أتمنى
continue to the
عليكم
next
عيد
paragraph here.
مبارك.
Over 1,200. Yeah, for the audience watching, out of respect. Over 1,200 years after the above incident, we Homo sapiens still have remnants of racism of Cyrus in our conscience. One of the founding fathers of our great nation, Abraham Lincoln, said there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, in favor of having the superior position aligned to the white race. Similarly, Thomas Jefferson said, I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that blacks, whether originally a distant race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in endowment both of body and of mind.
Yay. I mean, these things are obviously racist and made by, important American persons in the 18th and 19th centuries. Again, presenting that racism as being, still applying to today by implication, kind of.
This gets me to a interesting question, Culture Ginny. We're all Homo sapiens, yet we still enslave each other. What do you think
Yes.
would happen if there were other species of humans still alive today? For something like Neanderthals.
Oh, then it wouldn't be slavery. It would be just owning animals.
Yeah, because we know that Neanderthals, because of the cave paintings and the tools we see them use, had very similar mental capabilities that Homo
Yes,
sapiens also
but
had.
but it would be argued that this isn't true as slavery. This is just owning other animals or something like that. If other if other real species of humanity did still exist.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question that I would have. There's actually this movie called William, I believe, about some like they found this ovum of a Neanderthal still very viable. They put it into like a petri dish and give a live birth to a Neanderthal human in present day as an experiment. And that movie kind of like shows the species in a really bad light because they were almost identical to humans in multiple aspects. The only difference between they had a bit more of a stocky build, meaning they had the bot. An average Neanderthal was the equivalent of an Olympic lifter now. They can't run for shit, but they can like pick up a deer on their shoulder and carry it back a couple of kilometers. So, but the other things like the fine motor skills, the painting, the intellectual capabilities of organization, the language, and such were all quite similar to that of humans. So,
Yes.
yeah.
That, I mean, if we ever clone Neanderthals or any of the other human, like species, then this will get very messy ethical implications. Are they humans? Are they animals? Do we consider humans as, as humans with endowed with human rights, only those humans that are genetically Homo sapiens, or do we consider, entities that have human-like intelligence as beings that should be endowed with human rights? And then it becomes even weirder when you add AIs, robots, or uplifted animals, where you begin to genetically modify animals to get human-like intelligence.
Yeah, and I would also think that um, I think the genus Homo would be the standard.
So, everything that is within the genus Homo should be considered with having human rights.
Yeah, because the human, I believe, like you're gonna have to like fix my Latin here, but I think human derives from the term Homo, right?
Yes.
So I even from the derivation, and then the whole fact that they're in the genus means that the difference in the genetics would only be the difference between me and someone from sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic difference would not be that much. We would still be very viable options in terms of mixing. And people say, oh, chimpanzees and gorillas should also be considered humans because they're using tools and anatomically look like humans. But the thing is, genetically, we cannot mix. We're too far in the genetic spectrum, whereas a Homo neanderthalis and a Homo sapien would be able to genetically mix.
There did also exist some other. Was it Homo Cro-Magnon or
Yeah,
whatever its name was?
Cro-Magnon, Homo denisovans, Homo florentiensis from the Java region.
Yeah, there did exist other species of humanity that we either wiped out or we simply replaced
Yeah. All
or
right, so that was like
interbred
a
with until they got absorbed into Homo sapiens. Because we still have actually Neanderthal DNA, many of us.
within it. Yes, I believe like it varies anywhere between 2% to 6%. But yeah, let's move on to the next point. Sorry for a tangent there. I quote these statements of our founding fathers who have reaped our genuinely deserving deep-seated admiration, not to discredit them by washing their old dirty linens in public. I cite these to expose the hypocrisy of Cal Thomas, Hibby here, Fox Channel, and other Islamophobes with their egotistic representation of Western and Christian values over Islamic values.
Appreciation of the Western, not representation,
Appreciation.
of Western
Appreciation, my
and
bad. Yeah, my dyslexia is
appreciation of
acting up.
Western and Christian values over Islamic values. They know our nation rejected the racial ranking only after the birth of civil rights movement under the leadership of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. about 50 years ago. Reverend Martin Luther King gave his precious life for a dream to precious life to a dream to watch the white girls and black girls, white boys and black boys playing in our backyards as children of one nation under God. 200
But
years
what?
ago, this is just feeling. I don't have anything to. He does actually raise a kind of legitimate point here about this. There does exist, kind of almost a cult surrounding the founding fathers and the other important persons. Do not so much about Abraham Lincoln as Thomas Jefferson, where they are kind of seen almost in a almost divine light, I would say, in American culture, and praised for their virtues for creating the republic or being so important to American history. But it shouldn't be put under the table that they did also have a lot of views that in our modern day wouldn't really fit. I mean, they were children of their time, so I wouldn't judge them as an historian for their views. But they shouldn't also be praised to the skies without mentioning these issues. We should just see them as what they were, human beings that were a result of their time and place. Like all of us.
Because Abraham Lincoln never said that his viewpoint is for all time. So
no, I would assume that it was only Muhammad that was the case for. But let's go on.
All right, so 200 years ago, our nation dismantled the painful and repulsive system of slavery. We paid a heavy price of flesh and blood for the right cause under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, the world of Islam eliminated slavery by peaceful means. Oh, this is bullshit.
Bullshit! Bullshit!
We did an
When
entire.
you get me to swear, to use the word shit in a video, you know you have said something extremely moronic.
All right. I think in the next sentence they kind of like resolve it slightly. Islam at its origin did not encourage slavery, nor did it forbid it outright. This is also bullshit.
Yeah.
Prophet abolished slavery by one, the theology of religious atonement for sins, by the
emancipation of a slave, preventing taking free men into slavery, and prohibition of turning the prisoners of war into slaves. Which this is one of the few cases where it is completely legitimate to take slaves. What are you talking about? Improving the treatment of slaves by their owner, arguable for giving inalienable rights, a right to slaves to buy back their freedom. Not really. In certain cases, yes, but in certain cases, no. It depends very much upon the school of tradition and what the slave's function were. Because in certain cases, you didn't even pay the slave.
And giving rights to slaves to own personal property.
I mean, yes, but also no. Again, dependent upon case and school of thought and situation.
Yeah,
because slavery wasn't a monolith with the same rules everywhere in Islamic history. It was different cases for different types of slaves, for different situations of slavery, for different schools of thought. These things were very variable. I mean, you could have slavery where you more or less were just an indentured servant, where you did get paid for work, and then you were left free after you had worked off your debt more or less by doing paid work as a slave. You could just not leave the work, but you did have kind of like a slavery where you did get paid, and eventually you could pay yourself free. Then you also had slavery where you were taken as a slave somewhere from Africa, sold and brought into plantations somewhere in the Middle East, for example in southern Iraq, in the Ahwar region, and then worked to death with no chance of ever escaping it.
Yeah, and the human rights violations for human trafficking in the Arab and Gulf countries where they use scripture to defend it is very rampant. So,
yeah, I mean, to give Islam some due, though, it was less a result of Islam, this type of slavery and the slavery that developed in the Islamic world, as it was just a continuation of practices that had already existed.
Yeah. Now,
and a codification and regulation of it. It was just continuation under new management, more or less, when the Islamic armies took over a lot of the Middle East. It wasn't like Islam introduced slavery to the Middle East. It already existed there.
Yeah, so let's do this last section here because it's very much more relevant to modern times, I think, as well. And then I also have the studio booked for a half hour more, so I'd have to bounce.
All right, let's jump forward.
So all these Islamic legislations led to the death of slavery without shedding a drop of blood. Bernard Lewis, professor at Princeton, states, but is Quranic legislation subsequently confirmed and elaborated in the Holy Law, brought two major changes to the ancient slavery, which were to have uh, far-reaching effects. One of these was the presumption of freedom. The other, the ban of enslavement of free persons except strictly defined circumstances. The Quran was promulgated in Mecca and Medina in the 7th century. The backgrounds against which Quranic legislations must be seen in ancient Arabia. Arabs practiced a form of slavery, like that which existed in other parts around the ancient world. The Quran accepted the institution, but it urges kindness to the slaves and recommends, without requiring, liberation by purchase or manumission. The freeing of slaves is recommended both for the expiration of sin and as a simple act of benevolence. It exhorts masters to allow slaves to earn or purchase their freedom, and much more important change from the pagan era. The believing slave is now the brother of a free man in Islam and before God, and superior of the free pagan and idolaters. This point is emphasized in innumerable hadith traditions. The recruitment of slave populations by natural increase seems to have been small and right through to modern times in the Muslim world, insufficient to maintain numbers. This is striking contrast with the conditions in the New World, where slave populations increased very popularly. Several factors contributed to this difference, perhaps the most important being that slave populations in the Islamic Middle East were consistently drained by the liberation of slaves, sometimes as an act of piety, most commonly through the recognition and liberations by a free man of own offspring by a slave mother. Now, this is bullshit because if you were to take modern day, the Arab world or Islamic countries still have the highest number of human trafficking victims.
Bernard Lewis, speaks historically here, but even then, the problem is I haven't read this quote in its context, even this rather long part that is giving, a pretty, large picture of his views here. Bernard Lewis, I know he has died. He passed away a couple of years ago. He usually was a pretty good historian of the Middle East and wrote a lot of good works. But I do need to stress that I disagree with him here regarding this. Because in certain places of the Middle East, and again, the entire Islamic world is huge with large differences from place to place. But in certain places, they certainly had outright slave societies where slavery was used to such a degree that it was a significant portion of society. And it was also enough. So many slaves were there that, for example, this was the thing that was one of the reasons why the Sanj Rebellion was so successful in southern Iraq. The Sanj Rebellion was an event during the 9th century where a lot of black slaves revolted against their Abbasid overlords or on the plantations in southern Iraq, and it caused enormous amounts of damages. And that was an example of mass slavery. So there is also the fact when it comes to Bernard Lewis that I don't know what kind of slavery he's also discussing here. It could be that he's discussing household slavery, which isn't the same as plantation or mining slavery.
Yeah, and I'll clarify that as well, where the way they describe slavery in Arabia is almost like having a maid. I had a maid that came in India that came and did household work for me. Like she cleaned up the house, she made dinner, and she left. She washed the dishes and whatever, and she left. But the thing is, I was paying her a consistent salary. She came from 9 to 5. She went home. It was her job. It wasn't. There was no slavery. Like I go to office. They told me to do 2 things. She comes to my house. She does 2 things. and we both get compensated for our work. I did not own her as a slave. If they're talking
Yeah.
about maid services, then that's no longer slavery, that's employment.
Yeah, but I will also mention regarding Bernard Lewis here is that I can't comment upon since I don't know the context of his statement entirely, and this could be misquoted. But I do, with what I'm presented, I would also say that one of the reasons as to why we don't have, for example, enormous amounts of, for example, we still do have a lot of black people actually in Iraq, at least in the southern parts of Iraq. But one of the reasons as to why we don't have massive amounts of it is that they were worked to death and simply replaced. So this was actually arguably a worse form of slavery than what was practiced in, the southern states of America,
Yeah.
in the United States.
All right.
So-
And just to kind of, I
So
think this point is a very important point on that as well. So after you're done your thing, we'll cover this one, and I have a few points to say about that particularly.
all right, should we jump to the last part? Because
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying something. If you want to finish.
no, we can jump forward.
Yeah. So on the last point, finally, we have come to the question of why didn't the Prophet declare war on slavery as President Lincoln did? Prophet knew that a change of heart against slavery was the more important to abolish slavery permanently. The wisdom of the Prophet eliminated slavery with at least human suffering and disruption for his nation, his people. While more than 1 million died, millions suffered, and national life was disrupted by the U.S. Civil War as a result of pursuing policy for a swift abolition of the slavery by the U.S. Abraham Lincoln. Well, how about in Britain, where it was abolished fairly quickly as well, without that much harm?
Yeah, because you paid off the slave owners. There's also, that was what happened in the British Commonwealth. But there is also the fact that, for saying that should be slavery would be abolished. I mean, slavery continued in the Islamic world into the middle of the 20th century. And it even continued in certain parts of the Islamic world, like in Sudan and Mauritania, to the 21st century.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this was a long time to abolish it. And to say that it wasn't bloody, I mean, you had slave revolts like the Sench Rebellion on the 9th century, which I made a video about, by the way. If you want to look at it, go to my channel, The Culture Genie, and look into that video. And you also had, slave rebellions also in Andalusia, in the mines, this type of slavery, mines and plantation slavery, that are the worst kinds of slavery, which was the types of slavery where Islamic slavery was, if anything, even more brutal than the New World type of slavery that was introduced by the European powers. And you had a lot of deaths and a lot of, conflicts related to slavery. You also had slave raids, and, people also get killed in these slave wars as well. So, if you really wanted to minimize human suffering, it should have taken a lot. It should have been, abolished a lot sooner than in late human modern history.
Yeah. So
I mean, this is just apologetics for, the long tradition of slavery that did exist. This is a covering up of, what was a really, long history of slavery. Because, by our modern standards, slavery is wrong. I think that we should view history as, just a fact. We shouldn't moralize. So I don't think that we should blame modern Muslims for, slavery that was done hundreds of years ago. Though I would still blame, modern slave, those that have had slaves recently in modern time for, being slave owners. But I will not blame people that lived for several generations ago and that are dead by now for having practiced it. That's gone in history. It's important that we learn from history and that we study history, but it's also important that we don't use history as a whacking stick.
Yeah. So, any concluding statements that you want to do to summarize before we leave?
But we shouldn't also don't use history regarding slavery as a whacking stick. Don't, what we have talked about in this episode about Islamic slavery. This isn't to, blame modern Muslims or to say that modern Muslims are responsible for slavery, except if you were a slave owner in Sudan or Mauritania. Then in those cases, there is blame because you were actively as a person involved in this. But so history shouldn't be used to whack modern Muslims regarding slavery that happened in the past. But neither should it be whitewashed or be hidden away, because history and what has been done in the past should be still used as a font of knowledge so that we may learn from it and make a better future.
Yeah. And on the moral side and religious side of slavery itself, we have episodes. So there's one on Culture Ginny's channel as well. Culture Ginny, if you can send me that video, I'll link it in the description. And then there's also one that we did earlier this year, Moose, Culture Ginny, and I. It would be, if you guys want to go and watch those as well, as a refresher, that would be great. But in any case, thank you so much for this, Culture Ginny. If you can stay in the studio for 2 minutes so the recording can also stay. The recording can upload. All right. Let's end this recording.